What's up guys, it's River and today we're looking at the Panasonic G7. This is a really special camera because I think this is the best budget filmmaking, YouTubing, content creating camera on the market right now because it has pro features. It comes with two awesome lenses and all of that package. That is an insane deal in today's market. So let's do a deep dive, see exactly who this camera is for, exactly what it does, and if it's right for you. Let's get into it. So first things first, let's talk about specs. What makes this camera really interesting is the fact that it has a micro four thirds sensor. Now, a micro four thirds sensor is a slightly smaller sensor than your regular APS-C size sensor. A regular APS-C size sensor would be like 24 megapixel sensor, and this is a 16 megapixel sensor. But those 8 megapixels, I promise you will not notice it, and it is one of the reasons this camera is so affordable. It has an ISO range all the way from 100 to 25,600. However, I think this camera looks best at 3200 or 6400, and despite it being a smaller sensor, it is still very good in low light. For video, it still does all the way from 24 to 60 FPS, and yes, this is my favorite part, it does in-body 4K. Usually with cameras this small or this affordable, you have to get 4K by plugging into an external recorder, but this thing does internal 4K at 100 megabits per second. Specs wise, it's really impressive, and it really holds its own with other more expensive like $2,000 cameras. But what really impresses me about this camera package is the fact that it comes with two lenses. It comes with a 14 to 45 lens and a 45 to 105 lens. With those two lenses, you have everything covered. You literally, if you're a beginner filmmaker, you don't need other lenses. You can totally have all of your focal lengths covered. You will never want a wider lens or a closer lens. Those lenses really cover everything. So first, let's take a deeper dive into the photo features of this camera. So a couple things I really like about this thing from a photo perspective is the articulating screen. If you're a photographer, this is a very handy thing to have, and it just makes your job that much easier. It also has a viewing eyepiece, which is pretty dang decent, and it is really nice to actually be able to switch between the eyepiece and the screen with a small button on the side. It comes with a built-in flash, so if you're someone that's doing street photography, that's also really nice. As for the actual photo specs internally, it does 7 frames per second of RAW. And now that's a 16 megapixel camera, so you're not gonna get the highest studio level stuff with it, but if you're a beginner, a hobbyist, a young person, you're gonna be just fine with 16 megapixels. That is plenty. Also, one thing that I really appreciate about this camera is the fact that it has a little dial right here. Now, usually cameras only have one dial for changing modes, but this has a separate dial on the side for changing your photo mode. So you can go into single shots or burst mode. And also it has a really interesting feature called 4K burst. Now this camera only shoots at 7 frames per second, which isn't the fastest. It's decent, but there's other cameras out there that shoot at 11 frames or 16 frames per second. So the way this camera gets around that limitation is that it actually goes into 4K mode. It starts making a video, and it makes a little video for a few seconds at 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second, and then you can go into that video and go through every single frame and pick the perfect photo you want. Now that's really helpful if you're shooting sports or something that's really fast moving. You just make a 4K video. Now 4K is a lot of resolution, but at 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second, you're not missing any information, you're not missing any moments, so you can just go into that video and pull the perfect shot. That's kind of similar to live photos on the iPhone, but it's a very useful feature for shooting fast moving stuff or moments where you're not really sure exactly what you want and you just want someone to kind of do their thing and pull something from that. That is a very useful photo feature. Overall, for photos, I'd give this an 8 out of 10. Pretty dang decent camera. I don't think it's the best photo camera ever, but this is a pretty good offering for only 500 bucks. And also, what really makes this camera special, once again, is the fact that it comes with two of these lenses. These lenses will give you pretty much everything you want. I think without the lenses, this camera isn't that worth it. But with these two lenses, this is a very special camera. And with two lenses right off the bat, especially if you're a beginner, you're fine. You're not limited in any way by your lens choice. Next, let's talk about video in this camera, because I think video is really where this camera shines. Despite having only a 16 megapixel sensor, you still get full HD and internal 4K at 100 megabits per second. Plus, what really makes this camera special is the fact that at this price point, it has built-in cinema looks. What cinema looks are basically color profiles that you shoot on so that you have more room to grade and play around with the image after you're done shooting. This allows you to have more dynamic range, more options for how you want the color grading to look, and it really just lends to an overall more professional look, where cameras on this end just generally have like a flat standard color look that you kind of have to play with, but this gives you way more flexibility in the look that you want to get out of your camera. And also overall, the colors in this camera, the color science overall is very pleasing to the eye. I really like the way the skin looks. I really like the highlight roll off on the face. Basically the highlight roll off is the smooth highlight points on faces in the sky. Like when it goes from dark to white, it's very smooth and flattering. It doesn't look like a video-y image. Generally, very like inexpensive cameras tend to look very like toyish and very video-like, but this really lends to a very cinematic look, and I was very, very impressed with this camera. Next, let's talk about autofocus, and the autofocus situation with this camera is a little hit and miss. So this does have very fast and reliable autofocus. If you point it at something, it catches autofocus really quick, and it's there. It's sharp and it's focused and it's fast. That's something that I really, really like about it. The face tracking in this camera is very good. Face tracking as a technology overall is very advanced, and there's pretty much nothing on the planet that doesn't do good face tracking. However, this is where this camera kind of falls short. It doesn't have very good tracking autofocus. So if you're kind of moving around subjects, unless it's a face, it'll do a great job tracking a face. But if you're kind of moving around a plant, or if you're on a wide shot and there's a bunch of things in frame, it's not gonna track very well. The focus is kind of slow to catch on to things, and then it kind of hunts a little bit, which means it goes in focus, out of focus to try to figure out exactly what the best focus place is. And yeah, that's like a little unideal. If you're gonna be doing documentary work or like work where you're whipping around to different things, yeah, this autofocus system just isn't that great. What I have noticed works really well is that I'll kind of frame up, see what I wanna shoot, and then I'll half press the shutter button right here, and I'll catch focus really good, really fast. And then from there, I'll start shooting because I know I'm in focus. But from there, if I start to move in and out, the focus just kind of loses it. So that's the one place where I feel this camera falls short. But if you're gonna be making cinematic work with this camera, you're probably gonna wanna pull your own focus anyways, because if you're making cinematic work, you're really tweaking and playing with your image. You know you wanna like have full control of your gear, and you're gonna be playing with your manual focus anyways, so that won't be that much of a problem. Or if you're a YouTuber and you know that 80% of the time this camera is gonna be either staring at your face or someone else's face in frame, then you will be just fine, because this camera is very, very good at tracking faces. I just think if you're like a travel filmmaker that's like kind of doing a wide shot where you're whipping here and then whipping there, that's gonna be an issue. It's not gonna be able to catch those focus points very well, and that's the only place where I think in focus this camera falls short. I'd give it a 7 out of 10. It does most of what I need pretty well, but it's not perfect. It's not good like a Sony camera. Also, a quick side note, guys, the autofocus is way better in HD than it is in 4K. I think that's because the camera processor is prioritizing image data over autofocus data. So the autofocus just isn't quite as fast in 4K mode, and I think that's just because it's slowed down by all the extra imaging data coming from 4K. However, that's not really this camera's fault. This is kind of true for most cameras when you go from HD to 4K. So it's not really this camera, it's just where the technology is at right now. Next, let's talk about stabilization. So with this camera, the stabilization is actually built into the lens. And with most lens stabilization systems, it's pretty limited because it's cramped into such a small space. But I think with this camera, it does a pretty decent job. If you're a vlogger, a documentary person, or just shoots running gun stuff, it's gonna do a pretty decent job for you. But if you're shooting cinematic stuff or music videos, I definitely recommend getting a gimbal, because that's always gonna look more cinematic and stable than lens stabilization. Next, let's talk about ISO and low light performance. I was really surprised that this camera had really good low light performance despite having a smaller sensor. Obviously, the bigger your sensor, the more light you can capture on your sensor, and the better it is in low light. So despite being a smaller sensor, this camera has really good ISO performance. For photos, I'd recommend shooting this camera anywhere between 6400, 8000, and you will be just fine. I really wouldn't go up to 12,800. That you're gonna be too noisy there. However, with Lightroom and Photoshop, you can do wonders nowadays. You can really take all that noise and grain out. So if you do need to shoot that high, don't be too afraid. This camera's pretty decent for photos in low light. For video, the max ISO in video is 6400. 6400 is passable, but I really recommend shooting this camera at 3200 ISO for best results. Obviously, if you can shoot lower than 3200 ISO, you'll get a cleaner image, but I try not to go over 3200 ISO in like really like low light scenarios. But 6400, it's passable, but you will need to like apply noise reduction in post. Next, let's talk about the way this camera is designed and built. I'm absolutely in love with how they designed this camera. It has a button for pretty much every important setting. There's a button for ISO, focus modes, white balance. There's literally 5 different function buttons that you can program to do anything you want. There's literally a little flip up dial for different focus modes. There's a dial on this side for different photo modes, a dial for like different video modes or like overall modes. There's a dial for shutter, an aperture back here, like literally every single thing you need to change, they have a button for it. And I find myself never having to go into the menus to change things on this camera. Everything's just laid out for me for a button, and there's even like a dedicated record button, a dedicated photo button. Like this camera, the way it's laid out, honestly, it's better than the Canon 80D. It feels very solid in my hands. The hinges are like tight. The buttons are nice and clicky. I was super surprised. This does not feel like $500. This feels like $2,000 in my hands. Now, this is a very solid camera, and it's really an unbeatable package. Impressed by the battery in this camera. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about it, but this battery is honestly as good as like a Canon camera. It lasted me for 2 days, and I've been shooting on this thing constantly. Really impressed with the battery. I would recommend picking up a second or third battery just because it's good to be safe, but honestly, I was really impressed with the battery performance in this camera.